Hello, everyone. I'm Lauren Henry, Executive Director of U Chicago Alumni and a proud alumna of the college. I want to start today's session by just saying how amazing this community is, not only for being here for today's conversation, but also for all of the ways that you engage with and champion the University of Chicago as you go about your day to day, whether you're wearing a sweatshirt, talking about a book you read. There are so many ways to honor the university, and we're so grateful that you do it in your life every day. Here in Hyde Park, it's spring on campus, which means the quads are coming back to life. We're starting to see ivy on the buildings again. The big news this week, ducks are officially back in Botany Pond after it reopened from the renovation. Students are preparing for midterms and they're hard at work in classrooms and labs, exploring novel and challenging ideas. And I hope these vignettes just help a little bit to set the scene for today's conversation, which is an exploration of the history of the university with John Boyer. I'm going to hazard a guess that Professor Boyer actually does not need an introduction, but it is my privilege to briefly remind you of his accomplishments today. So John W. Boyer is Senior Advisor to the President and Martin A. Ryerson Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of History. He served as Dean of the College from 1992 to 2023. During his tenure as dean, he broadened the college curriculum to include many new core courses and new programs of advanced study, in addition to strengthening the college's admissions program. He worked to create many new opportunities for students involving foreign study, internships, and foreign language instruction, to broaden student research opportunities, to enhance the relationship of the college to the professional schools, to build 4 major on-campus facilities for residential life, to strengthen programmatic and financial resources for student life, and to provide strong career advising programs for college students. A specialist in the history of the Hapsburg Empire and Central Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries, John earned his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1975 and joined the faculty that same year. And finally, he is, of course, a great historian of our incredible university, which is the topic of our discussion today. And joining him for today's conversation is Steve Rings, an associate professor of music whose research focuses on popular music, voice, and transformational theory. He is currently completing his second book, Sounding Bob Dylan, Music in the Imperfect Tense. Before becoming a music theorist, Professor Rings was active as a classical guitarist, performing in the US and in Portugal. And he is also resident dean of Campus North Residential Commons here on campus. So please join me in welcoming Professors Boyer and Rings to the virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It's wonderful to be here, really an honor to be here with John Boyer to discuss his enlarged edition of his history of the University of Chicago. When I was thinking about this event, I was reflecting on the many ways that the University of Chicago is a singular place, unlike any other university. And one of those ways is in its sense of its own history. We on the campus, faculty and students alike, are very aware of this institution's history and often tell and retell it. That's part of the culture of the place. It's been that way since I arrived here 20 years ago. But it's also due in no small part to John Boyer's presence on this campus for 50 years, 50 plus years. John is one of the world's great historians, and he has also been a leader of this university. Those two things could have been entirely separate, but he chose at some point to turn his historian's practice toward documenting the history of the university in this extraordinary book that we are discussing today. So my first question for you, John, is how did that turn happen? How did you come to write this history of the University of Chicago?
Yeah, thank you, Steve, and a warm welcome to all of the alums and other friends of our great university who are joining us today. So it's a very big book. It's like 700 pages. So I'll talk a little bit fast because I want to save time for questions. So the book is basically an attempt to figure out where we came from, where we are now, and hopefully to make some open some possibilities of where we would go in the future, because I do think that confusion about our past can lead to uncertainty about our future, and at the same time, clarity about our past can lead to a greater rational and effective planning for the future. So the book is really about three large epics: the founding of the university, Harper working with Rockefeller to put together this extraordinary plan that had an integrated university, not just a college, not just graduate schools, not just professional schools, but all together a kind of one university. And this is a kind of a rhetorical trope that flows through the history of the university. We're not a divided university. We're not a fragmented university or one university, but using the resources of philanthropy and I would say civil society. We are not founded by the state. We are a civil society institution kind of built from the bottom up. People of Chicago, folks in New York and elsewhere creating our university with the help of Harper and the faculty. So there's support from the philanthropic side, but also a uncanny ability to attract high quality faculty, really distinguished faculty, whose mission is to pursue in a kind of very singular and determined way academic excellence. So the place is kind of founded on the assumption that universities exist to advance and to sustain and to convey knowledge. They can do many other things, some of which they might or might not want to do, but that's their core function. And in order to do that, you need great faculty, but you also need distinguished students. And so we were very blessed by having in the early student body, men and women, we were coeducational, this is very important for our history, a highly meritocratic, a highly disciplined, a highly with a strong kind of work ethic student body whose culture comes to fit and map very wonderfully on the culture of the faculty. And so you've got a student body, a faculty, you've got a mission involving free and open discourse, and the university is very famous for articulating principles of academic freedom and free, but that's freedom in the service of scholarship, freedom in the service of academic excellence, freedom to advance knowledge, and to do so in a dispassionate and objective and I would say a very open-minded way. So this all comes together, but in a remarkable confluence. By 1914, we're one of the great universities of the world. We didn't exist in 1890, and within 15 years, our people, the men and women who created this place had done something so remarkable that it's really a stunning example of an institutional building. So that's the first part. The second part has to do with the interwar period. And here the figure of Hutchins, Robert Hutchins, becomes very salient, because what Hutchins does is to kind of take all of that and basically overlay it with this, what I would say, the rhetoric of the life of the mind, and the reforms that he does in the college, creating the core curriculum, in a sense, making the college a very intensive example of this advancement of knowledge and dedication to knowledge on the part of our youngest students, really helps to kind of solidify, enhance the reputation of the university in the world of higher learning. And I'd be happy to talk more about that. And then the third part of the book is really the recovery after 45. We have a hard 1950s. There are some very perilous things that happened to the place. The college is rebuilt. The graduate divisions are sustained in their excellence. And then there's this remarkable flourishing of professional education at Chicago, which is in some ways a hallmark of the current university. It wasn't so much a hallmark of the university before 45. And so today you have this extraordinary kind of melding together of liberal education on the vibrant college, very distinguished arts and science research faculties, and then these extraordinary professional schools. So that's the kind of architecture of the book. And there's an awful lot of detail along the way, but that's kind of like what I set out to write in 700 pages or less. So.
Great. So in those 700 pages and in doing all of the archival research that you did to write the book, what was most surprising to you? I tend to imagine you, my fantasy of you is that you have all of this history, that you came with it like pre-installed and you knew all of this already, but presumably there are things that you discovered in the archives that were surprises. So I'm curious what the biggest surprises were for you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fascinating question. And I think there were a couple of, there were many surprises, but in kind of like large structural surprises, was I would say the capacity of the institution, by which I mean the leadership and also faculty and students as well, to have a kind of appetite for risk taking and a kind of planning entrepreneurship with a small e, that is really quite remarkable. Hutchins was a guy who was constantly inventing new plans. Some of them didn't work. He just went on to the next one. And this led us to have capacity for innovation. And as we innovate, we create tradition. So you have this kind of deep tradition, almost mythic tradition of the university that's set in its ways as having a fixed identity, but all the while it's constantly kind of innovating and changing. The innovations led to many great things, the core, a lot of other stuff. It also led to some near disasters. And so you have Hutchins, for example, is attempt to restructure the undergraduate program to admit very young high school students, which was an absolute disaster and really almost wrecked the university financially for 20 or 30 years. So it's this interplay between high ambition, pride, not recklessness, but a kind of willingness to step outside of the, well, we've always done it that way, or we're waiting to do something that nobody's ever done until nobody ever wants to do it, and to actually move forward. And I never really appreciated that quality of the place. It's a kind of a risky quality to have, but and you have to have be able to sleep at night. But it's a place that is loves its past, but it's kind of always kind of looking toward the future. And when I started the book, I didn't really have such a palpable sense of that.
Yeah, great. So along those same lines, I mentioned before that there is a strong sense of the place's history here among the faculty. But some of this, I think of, and you and I've talked about it before, is kind of a folk history, that there are certain things that are almost urban legends about the university or things that you hear. So for example, when I arrived, there were twice as many graduate students as undergraduates in 2005. And I heard, oh, it was ever so. And the university was designed with that in mind. It was designed primarily for graduate students, and this was all intentional. But my understanding from you and from your book is that there are, in fact, other historical accidents between the school's founding and early 2000s that got us there. So that would be one example. I'm curious if there are others or if I've gotten that one right.
No, I could just give you two. I mean, you're absolutely right. One involves demography, the demography of the place. I mean, I said earlier that one of the salient defining features of our school is that the Harpers really focus on graduate education in the arts and sciences as a kind of defining feature. And this is the 1890. We're not talking about today or 1950. And originally, Harvard really wanted a larger graduate school than a smaller college. It turns out that financially and for a lot of other reasons, that wasn't plausible. And he quickly changed his mind. And by the time he passes, the college was already probably bigger than the graduate school. And that really was the case down to World War II. We had a pretty large college. Our college was larger than Stanford, larger than Princeton, larger than Yale before World War II. The enrollments collapsed because of a series of I have to say, questionable judgments on the part of the leadership back then. And so when I joined in the 70s, and when you came, there was still this kind of myth, well, we're primarily a PhD factory, we're primarily a doctoral program. That was kind of an accident of history, because what happened in the 50s, they began to admit lots of graduate students, basically, and have them pay tuition. They became the tuition-paying students to replace the undergraduates whom we never had. And so it's which was a morale problem for the graduate students, because you had a lot of people coming, taking out loans and so forth, and maybe not finishing their degrees. And at the same time, you have a diminished undergraduate student population, which means you have real problems in terms of alumni development and your alumni cadres down the line. Your undergraduate alums tend to be very important for the future of the university in all kinds of ways. Anyway, so that's kind of one thing that it's something that people, you kind of have to look at the enrollment statistics and unpack it. The other thing is, Lauren said, I didn't, when I was dean, spent a lot of time and I would say financial resources coming from the donations of the alums and parents on career planning and helping make sure the students have good, solid opportunities after college. Now, this was somewhat controversial at the time. People were saying, like, but what are you trying to do? Change the college into a vocational school? And well, we weren't, although we do want people to have good opportunities after college. But the early university actually was very conscious of these kinds of issues, because many of our students were going to go on to what? To become teachers, men and women. Many of them were going on into the professions. And the curricula of the early university, really up to the 1920s, was very oriented toward these kinds of professional outcomes. They didn't have the formal resources that we have now. But so in some ways, it's possible to lose sight of these facets of our history. It's quite understandable. And one of the things that is useful is to bring them back. I also, there's a new story out on the web about Elizabeth Wallace, this wonderful woman who was chartered by Harper to create a study abroad program in Paris in 1900. It didn't work because there was of resources. And I remember reading that early on in my deanship and saying, like, okay, but Wallace, great opportunity, didn't work. Maybe we could try again. And 25 years later, we've just opened this great new center in Paris. So you sometimes and along the way, well, we've never done that before. Well, yeah, actually, we did try to do that. Harper and various people wanted to do it, and so maybe in our time we could do it. So I do think it's important to push back on the myths, not to destroy myths, but in a way to have as I said, a clearer understanding of our past, so we can have a better possibilities to chart our future.
Great. So this is kind of a fantasy of time travel question. If you could go back and talk to one of the former presidents, which one would it be, and what would you talk about?
Well, the longest chapter in the book, and it's dangerous to talk about one's favorite chapter because it's like talking about your children or grandchildren, and it's kind of invidious. But the chapter that was the most difficult for me to write and the most fascinating was the one on Robert Hutchins. Hutchins comes to university as a relatively young man. I think he's 29 or 30 years old, from dean of the Yale Law School. He was I would say, a good scholar. He wasn't a particularly distinguished scholar, but he was a remarkable leader and an extraordinary charismatic speaker. And his ability to use words and rhetoric and his speeches in the 30s on higher education, defending academic freedom, are still classic documents today. So he shows up here, and 6 months later, the Depression hits. And he had come to a university with roaring 20s. There was a lot of wealth, and all of a sudden it disappeared through, we can talk about the Great Depression. And so his presidency is a series of decisions about trying to save the place, literally save it. So Northwestern almost went under, and we did not, but we could have gone under. Anything can happen. And he does so through some remarkable, I would say, successful interventions. He doesn't create the core curriculum, but he's able to get it approved. There were other people had the idea, but he was able to kind of sell it and operationalize it. And then, of course, the stirring events of academic freedom in the late 30s, the Walgreen Affair and so forth. I'd like to be able to talk to him about what it was like to actually live through those events, because they were certainly high stress events. And again, when you're in the Depression and the market has collapsed, and this is not for a few days. It's like going to be collapsed for 10 years. What do you do? On the other hand, I alluded to this decision that he takes to recenter the baccalaureate program, and I explained, I hope a fair way why he did this. I'd like to actually sit down with him and say, okay, Bob, can you run that by me again? What's the what are the arguments for and against and so forth? And I think he would be honest enough to actually, he would still probably say, yeah, he was right, and my critique is wrong, but it would be interesting to have him do it. The other person, of course, who's one we really want to talk to, it was an equally important, as our founding president, Harper. Harper's relationship with Rockefeller is a fascinating one, because Harper was always spending money he didn't have. And it's usually Rockefeller's money. There were trustees like Martin Ryerson, whose name sure I have the honor to hold, who were kind of intermediaries. But I would love to know from Harper, what did he say to Rockefeller, and how did he say it to keep those resources going? Because Rockefeller was basically sustaining the university for a number of years, at a point when you might say, look, guys, ladies and gentlemen, this is over. This has got to stop. And it had something to do with his faith in Harper, but also Harper's ability to explain the uniqueness of the opportunity and the importance of a distinguished institution for the advancement of knowledge, free expression of ideas in the Middle West in Chicago. And he was this, I think one of the things that Harper and Hutchins were that they shared, a quality they shared, is the ability to communicate effectively. You could say our mission, or what we are, and to persuade important third parties to invest in us and to help protect us.
Great. One of the other things I love about reading this book is that the two presidents you've just mentioned are, of course, the top line names that one tends to hear, Harper and Hutchins. But there are plenty of other presidents in between and after. And one of the things I like as well about reading about them is you realize why certain buildings are named what they are. Ah, okay. That was our second president. Got it. I'm curious, among those other leaders of the university, which are the names that really rise up to you as the most distinguished? And I suppose there's a shadow side to that question, which would be, which presidencies were the most fraught?
No. So that's a very good and good University of Chicago candid question. It deserves a candid answer. It's a very hard job, and it's particularly a hard job because this place, our university, has always needed strong presidential leadership. When we haven't had it, we've gotten into all kinds of issues and problems. I've had the privilege of actually knowing many of our presidents, beginning with John Wilson. I knew Levy. I'm very close to Hannah Gray. She appointed me to the job. I've worked very closely with Hugo Sonnenschein and Don Randall, and then spent 15 years working with Bob Zimmer. I mean, these are all very distinguished people. They were all very effective in different personalities, different issues, different styles of leadership. But one of the reasons why I was asked by the press to do a second edition of the book was to bring the story down to talk about Bob Zimmer's leadership as president since 2006. And Zimmer returns from Brown. He had been provost at Brown. He had been here before as a professor and worked as an associate and deputy provost. But he comes back in the summer of 2006 to become our president. I met him that summer, and I remember asking him, what are your ambitions? He had a whole cascade of things he wanted to do: complex science, engineering, which ended up becoming molecular engineering, the revitalization of the neighborhood, the 53rd Street project, which is a very complicated and heavy list, and I do devote some pages to how that happened. International education. It's under Zimmer's presidency that we opened centers in Beijing and Delhi and Hong Kong. We had already opened the center in Paris. In some ways, Paris, which was founded during Don Randall's administration, becomes a model for what they were doing. A whole set of things involving the city, close partnerships between our university and Rahm Emanuel's senior staff downtown. And then finally, Zimmer, kind of in the middle of his presidency, becomes very much a passionate kind of re-articulator and defender of academic freedom and free expression. And these are all facets of a presidency that are made for a great presidency. Again, Zimmer, he made choices. He faced dilemmas. You could say, well, was this or that one the right way to go? It's always easy to second guess these things. But we've been blessed by having, I would say, including our current president, Paul Alvisotis, is a great president and a very strong leader. We've been very blessed by having men and women who had a capacity to understand the unique nature of the university while also not being frozen in place by that uniqueness. Zimmer was an iconoclast. Hugo Sonnenschein, who was a wonderful guy, and we became close friends, who was a kind of a supreme iconoclast. And great universities need that kind of iconoclasm. I once joked about Hutchins, he loved to get up in the morning and do things that would drive the faculty up the wall. At the same time, when he left, the faculty bemoaned, please don't resign. Many of those people along the way was like, when is he going to leave? Because we can't take it anymore. And so there's this interplay between a kind of dynamic leadership for the long term, and the day-to-day traffic, proposing things and getting them done. But we've been very lucky by having a series of strong leaders, and I would say also effective provosts and deans and so forth. But most of all, we've been lucky by having a distinguished faculty who believe in academic excellence and the importance of generating knowledge in a dispassionate way. And then I have to say, from coming from all the years I spent in the college, the student body is really quite remarkable. It's to teach these students is a privilege, and that sounds like a platitude or cliche, but it's actually it doesn't just happen. We in a sense we get the students we deserve, and we deserve them because of who we are. So there's this wonderful interconnection between our culture and the intensity of our culture and the quality of these young minds who are going to go on and do wonderful things for our nation, whatever political views or social views they may have, but that's kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So one other way to think about the university's sense of its history is that it's a place where the past is really in the present, that there is a palpable sense of continuity between past and present, and we're often bringing the past back as a way to inform present action and chart the way forward. How do you think the university's history helps us think our way into where the university is going now, especially in the present day with all of its challenges? What sorts of lessons do we get from the history that help guide our decisions going forward?
Yeah, I think it's important to go back to where I began. How we came to be who we are and who made us who we are. This university, like I think many great universities, is the product of generations of devoted and passionately committed people, men and women, doing all kinds of things, in our case, to advance knowledge and to communicate that knowledge to our students, and also as science in public service to the nation and to our community. Again, because the founders had a very practical sense of the value of scientific knowledge. It wasn't simply something for itself; it was also something for the good of our society. And if you keep those values in mind, and the current discussions about free expression and academic freedom and so forth, they're very important. And if you look at the two iconic statements that are often cited now about Chicago, the Calvin report from 1967 and the Shills report from 1970, Calvin on political neutrality, free expression, Shills on kind of academic excellence. These are iconic statements that are, in some ways, you can read them and publish them and talk about them as current documents, policy documents, but they also come out of a deep history. The individuals who wrote those documents had been at the university for many years. They came out of a world in which the kinds of values and the kinds of norms that I just associated in the importance of academic excellence, the importance of dispassionate learning, the importance of free and open discourse in service of research, the importance of high standards, merit, as opposed to who do you know and this kind of stuff. Those documents they live and they derive from those clusters of values, and I think the more we can maintain our understanding of those values and where they came from, the more we will understand how we should conduct ourselves in the present and deal with the many challenges that we face. We have many challenges now. We'll probably have many challenges, and Hutchins had tremendous challenges in the 1930s. But if you read Hutchins' speeches, there is this constant recovery or rearticulation of these, what I say, these foundational 5 or 6 values. And Levy does that again in the 60s. Levy was a student and actually a young friend of Hutchins. So it's almost as if there's this kind of passing of the torch, that the talking about what we do, Clement Attlee was once asked, the labor leader, how did Winston Churchill win World War II? And he said simply, he talked about it. He was talking about Churchill's great speeches rallying the nation, not just empty words, but talking about the values of that culture defending against Nazi tyranny. And it's important that we talk about our values and remember where they came from, because so many people work so hard to get us where we are. It would be a danger for us to kind of foolishly discard those or ignore that history. So I'm sounding like a professional historian, but I do think in this case, remembering something about our distinguished past, our educational achievements, the good that we've done for the nation, is something we need to talk and remind people about.
Great. Well, I have just one more question, and then we'll go to questions from our attendees. We have many. but my last question is actually about your status as a professional historian and a historian of the Habsburg Empire. And I'm curious how your lifelong project of being a historian of that empire, how it talks to this history of the University of Chicago. Are there things that you learned in the Hapsburg case that somehow resonate here, or is it just apples and oranges?
Well, that's a great, thank you so much, because that leads me to also try to hawk my other book that I published recently, the Austrian History. That's 1,131 pages by Oxford, also available on Amazon, by the way. No, seriously. So it's an interesting question because in some ways I was writing that book, and it's kind of like a lifetime project. It was published a couple of years ago on the Habsburgs down to contemporary Austria. While I was dean and also while I was writing the Chicago history, it's not easy to write two books at once, and I actually had to sequence it. But so anyway, to your question, the old empire was this extraordinary amalgam of different peoples, different ethnic peoples, different ethnic people who characterized themselves as belonging to different ethnic groups, different language groups, different and oftentimes competing and even rival religious groups, identities. And it was governed by a central administration, a government that sought to not simply kind of keep a lid on all of this stuff, but actually to find ways that you could encourage cooperation and collaboration for the advancement of all, while also acknowledging the needs of each individual group. And I've often said that, one of the lessons I learned is the importance of administrative leadership, not simply as conflict resolution, but trying to find ways to bring rival or often different opinions of whether they're academic opinions or financial opinions and so forth, together in a productive way, while also continuing to change the institution and revive, because the empire was seen an enormous change technologically, materially, militarily, also dealing with all of these ethnic and religious and linguistic consequences. So that's kind of one facet. I had an enormous respect for the idea of a civil service. And I would say, one of the kind of forgotten people collectively in the history of our university are our staff. The secretaries, the assistant to whatever, the associate people. But these are the people who actually make the university work. And on a day-to-day basis, they have enormous influence and enormous responsibility. And I want to pay tribute to them. In some ways, I gained a real sense of that. The other thing, this is an empire that goes through multiple revolutions, multiple disasters, the Nazi occupation, Austrofascism, the Allied, and it gave me a real sense of the fragility of institutions, how easy one can lose something that one takes for granted, and how difficult it is to rebuild. Which then goes back to this notion of wise stewardship to begin with. And so that, and luckily, contemporary Austria today is one of the most successful countries, whatever, what national wealth, educational levels, economic productivity in the EU. But it was not always like that. And one only has to look at the fate of the countries who ended up on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain in 1955, who are now part of the EU, but who are struggling to kind of reach the level of I would say, prosperity, and that the Austrians do. Administrative decisions make a difference, and institutions make a difference in people's lives, and that's why to come back to your question about presidential leadership makes an enormous difference, and having leaders who are not only wise but also have I would say the credibility and legitimacy to lead through conflicted times, because this has been in recent times kind of revolving door for presidents and provosts in our country and other countries of universities. This is a sign in which you have a kind of instability or fragility of leadership that's bound to have, I think, problematic consequences for those institutions. Anyway, I hope people will buy my Austria book too. Maybe on a different day. Okay.
Great. So I do have a first question here that picks up on this idea of institutions and the roles of institutions and the roles of individuals. This is, I should also flag, a very UChicago question, really, in the spirit of this place. And it's not ostensibly about the university's history, though it can easily be related. Were individuals or institutions responsible for the Age of Enlightenment? I told you it was a UChicago question. Are there lessons to be drawn from this age for today?
Well, let me answer that without giving a lecture on the 18th century Enlightenment, either the European or the American Enlightenment, which is very important, for our history and certainly for the history of the development of modern conceptions of liberalism and constitutionalism in Europe. In some ways, the object of scorn and almost ridicule during the Enlightenment was often the churches. I'm writing a book now on religion and politics and modern Europe for Princeton, and so I'm thinking about this, and I'm actually going to teach a class tomorrow to 18 bright students about this topic. But anyway, so the churches, which are institutions, they're faith communities, Protestant, Catholic, different kinds of Protestants, Jewish, other faith communities. These are communities that are seen oftentimes to be inimical to the Enlightenment, against the Enlightenment. Hence, you have the French Revolution attacking the churches in the name of enlightened thought and so forth. But if you unpack it, it turns out those communities were very complicated groups, and there were actually a lot of free thinkers, kind of Jansenistic proto-Augustinian types, who actually ended up, believe it or not, supporting the revolution in 1789, all in the name of both reconciling churches and religion. So the Enlightenment is a story of individuals, in this case, people who thought freely, who were kind of tagged because of their institutional membership as being, conservative with a small c and so forth. But the more you get into it, the more complex the story becomes. And these churches become very important because they are large institutions of civil society. University is not a church. None of our universities are churches, at least the non-denominational. Even the denominational universities are not churches. But we are institutions like the churches that have deep pasts. We've been created by civil society. Governments usually don't create churches. We weren't created by a government. And there are really quite interesting parallels between the fate of the churches in the modern world and the fate of universities. And I'd be happy to come back and give a lecture on that further. But it's a fascinating question. Let's put it that way.
Great. All right, second question. What were some of the most courageous decisions of University of Chicago leaders over the years?
I think there were, there were a number of very powerful decisions. Hutchins' defense of the university in the 30s and 50s in terms of academic freedom, obviously, that was very hard to do that. It was a very lonely thing to do. We can celebrate him now as a champion, a hero, but that was tough, and he did it. But he did it in the context of a university whose values, as inscribed in the Calvin Report and the Shields Report, were clear about, it wasn't just freedom, full stop. It was freedom for what? For the advancement of knowledge and objective learning. I have to think, I do want to pay tribute to Hugo Sonnenschein. The late 1990s, and the alums on the call who had lived through that era, they were very controversial. There was the proposal to expand the college, which was Hugo's idea, and previous presidents had been moving in this direction too. Edward Levy, John Wilson, certainly Hunter Gray. But Hugo, was very forthright, sent a letter to the faculty in 1996, we're going to add 1,000 students. Basically, the place kind of went up, and I wouldn't say in flames, but in turmoil, denunciations, petitions and so forth. And it was, having lived through all that, and I was kind of part of it, it was a time in which clearly, Hugo could have said, no, it's too hard. We'll go back. And he didn't do that. He persisted, and it was exactly the right decision to take. And it probably came at, I would say, some cost to him personally, but he provided the kind of strong leadership, thoughtful leadership that was necessary to do that. And then he was subsequently with Don Randall and Bob Zimmer. We had leaders who then supported Hugo wanted to add 1,000 students to college. I've been very candid. My goal was always to get us to 7,000, and we finally reached that in 2019. So that's a kind of a healthy, permanent stay. But that was a tough decision, and it's still, you could debate it, and it was debated quite openly at the time. But it took a lot of courage to do it, and I have enormous admiration for what Hugo did and what he did.
Wonderful. All right, this next one's kind of a deep cut UChicago history question. One sometimes thinks of UChicago as primarily academic / ivory tower. But from its early years, community engagement was quite in evidence. People like Edith Abbott and Sophie Nisbet Breckenridge. The local community research center was central to social science activity in the 1920s. To what extent has community engagement been sustained throughout the university's history?
Yeah, that's a very good and important question. It highlights the commitment of the university, or I'd say of the faculty and faculty leaders to work in and for the community, not as political activists, although, Charles Merriam did run for mayor and served as alderman, but I mean, that was a rather exceptional situation. But, our Department of Education, for example, the work of Charles Judd in assisting with scientific advising the public school system. This is which is still, we're still doing that today with the consortium and so forth. So those are long traditions, and they're sustained. That one of the things that Bob Zimmer was keenly interested in doing is enlarging those portfolio of connections in which we could bring what we do best, namely discovering and advancing knowledge, to bear on advancing the success of communities and in the city and as a whole, and then beyond. And I think the charter schools, which that decision was taken by Sonnenschein, but it's still a very important decision today. So, and it's a pattern that goes all the way back to the beginning of the university. Again, the men and women who founded this place were very practical people. They were very idealistic people. They were brilliant people. They were big thinkers and deep thinkers, but they also had a profound sense that the science was good unto itself, but also could be science in the service of the nation, science in the service of the community. And so this interplay between the activities of our faculty in the social sciences, the biological sciences, the humanities, and the professional schools, and our city is a constant. It's gone up and down depending upon faculty leadership and faculty research dispositions. But certainly, I think in the last 20 years, the university has been keenly interested in advancing this, and so recovering those older collaborative interactions between the city and community and the university that Harper was so proud of.
Great. All right, this next question is about your place in the history of the University of Chicago. I would love to hear a little of your thoughts on your time as dean of the college and the role it played in the university's history.
Okay, well, that's I have to say that the book is not an autobiography, but seriously, thank you for the question. It's a serious question and a good question. It was a challenge for me to write the book in a sense because I had half one foot in what was happening, with the Sonnenschein administration, Randall, Zimmer, and now the current administration, and then half foot out. So when I'm writing, am I writing as a professional scholar, dispassionate, objective, or am I writing it as an insider who's got secret knowledge and his or her own private views? And it's a constant struggle, and I hope I resolved it more in favor of the dispassionate scholar as opposed to the alternative. I'm enormously grateful to Hannah Gray for asking me to be dean. And I told the story many times, when she was invited me to her office, and when you were asked to go to Mrs. Gray's office, you didn't know, like, okay, what have I done? It was a very friendly and kind. And
going to the principal's office.
Very, very friendly and kind person. And she offered me the job, and I said, well, can you tell me a little about, like what do you want me to do? And she said, you have to remember, this is not a conventional deanship. It's really like a college presidency. and I didn't really understand. If she said the words and I took them in, I didn't really understand. But when we got into the job, and we back then, and with all due respect, which again sounds totally platitude-like and cliche-like, um, we were a great college, but we were admitting 70% of the students who applied to get a class, and we were having dropout rates that were north of 15 to 20. I mean, there were real problems. And I was told as the young dean, well, don't change anything because that's, because we're great and we're famous, and you just should, be like a custodian to keep the trains running. And then the Hugo Sonnenschein shows up from Princeton, who's also a change agent. And so the 90s became really this quite remarkable time of enormous change. Some people thought that was reckless change, but I think it turned out well. Nothing ever has to turn out well, but this one did. And so it became a fascinating laboratory for me to kind of study the kind of issues that I was writing about in that Austrian history. Namely, how do you manage to govern an institution or lead an institution in which there's a lot of turmoil, a lot of dissension, a lot of disagreement anyway, and at the same time, keep the team together and move it down the field. And so it was this fascinating interplay. And the kind of history that I ended up writing is profoundly indebted to the experiences I had in working in the college and in that 30 years. It's that said, it is challenging to write contemporary history. And one of the things that I did for the Zimmer, the latest edition, I had to interview a lot of people about Bob Zimmer. There isn't really a written archive yet. Eventually, there probably will be. I didn't have access to Bob's emails, and I didn't want them. And so I felt like I was a New York Times reporter interviewing trustees, faculty, friends, sometimes multiple times. And I have to say, I gained an enormous respect for the free press and what reporters do, and their persistence, and oftentimes, sometimes the annoyance with which they do it in trying to discover truth, or at least accuracy. And so that the last part of the book is actually based upon a very large oral history archive, which I never did that before. It was really quite fascinating, and I'm very grateful to all the people who were willing to be badgered by my questions.
I actually have a follow-up to that myself. I'm just curious what it's like, getting back to where you started your answer, to be writing a history where all of a sudden at a certain point, you yourself are a character in the story.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a strange moment? Do you think of yourself in the third person? Do you, because obviously this doesn't happen in your history of the Habsburg Empire. There's no moment in which John Boyer appears on the scene.
Thank goodness. No. Yeah. No, and in fact, well, if you read the book, I refer to the dean of the college. I never refer to him. But I did have a sense of the events that were happening, the motivations and different opinions that were governing different decisions. And I was blessed by having I'm not a paper, a fetishizer of paper, but I keep a lot of records. And the deanship of the college is, because of the nature of the enterprise, is kind of like, it's like being dean of the liberal arts in the university, but with a small d. So I had access to an enormous amount of information about different views, different opinions, different, why did we decide to redevelop 53rd Street? Like, how did we do that? It turned out to be extraordinarily complicated. And so I think I had enough, perhaps even more than I needed, information to create I would say, an objective portrait. I think, at least I hope, a fair portrait of what happened. And, clearly I had my own views and so forth. Sometimes they were right, sometimes they weren't so right. That's the way it goes. But it's a fascinating problem. I think anyone who engages in really contemporary history, writing about living people as opposed to people who are no longer with us, faces this problem. And I think one just has to do the best you can in as dispassionate and honest way you can. Having kind of been at the university long enough and subscribed to our own code of values about this, the importance of thinking about the difference between opinions and facts, okay? That's one of the great things we teach in the college. And anybody's entitled to opinion. You're not entitled to your own facts. That sounds like a cliche, but it's actually true. And and you have to listen to people who have very different political or social views than you, and you have to have an answer to their challenges. You can't just say, "I'm going to put my fingers in your ear. You don't. I don't like what you said, so I'm going to walk away," or bark at you or something. That's not how our culture works. Having lived that for so many years as a faculty member, it actually made it somewhat easier to kind of chart my way through these complex issues. And they were very complex and controversial that kind of perplexed our history. So it's a fascinating question.
Yeah. All right, next question. Sort of in the same zone, recent history. What have been the most significant, unanticipated changes at the university over your tenure here?
Well, I think I alluded to this earlier. I think if you look at the and again, other people might have somewhat different views of this. If you look at the way in which the university presented itself to the outside world, let's say, certainly in the scholarly world, up to the 1940s, it was basically a kind of a very extraordinary powerhouse of kind of arts and science learning and so on. Our business school was a good business school, but it was mainly an undergraduate school. And the law school was small. It was a nice law school, but it struggled a lot and had real problems during the Depression. And we didn't have a public policy school. Our medical school was very new. It was founded, in the maybe only the late 20s. And so, and the college became famous for a while with Hutchins and the core curriculum. But then, we have real problems with undergraduate learning in the 50s. And so, but over time, over the last 50 years, I think beginning with Levy and then with Hannah Gray and other leaders, there's been an effort to maintain the quality of what I would call the arts and sciences graduate enterprise. The faculty teach college students a lot too, but in terms of research publication, but also to have massive investments to kind of transform the college, which a lot of people, myself included, had to work on. But there's also been this extraordinary flourishing of graduate education. The law school and business school are now top 5 schools in the world. The Harris School is flourishing, much larger than it was. I mean, we have a public policy school and it's flourishing. The medical school has made significant improvements. The divinity school has always been very strong. And so if you look at the demography of the school, university, it's kind of like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And I think professional education is very important because our colleagues who teach in the professional schools are outstanding scholars. Many of them have degrees in the arts and sciences. And there's this kind of blending effect between economics and law, economics and or psychology and business that enriches the whole university. And so in some ways, I think the university is stronger because of this transformation, but it is a real change. And there have been concerns like, well, if this goes up, does that mean that the other part goes down? And to kind of paraphrase Wittgenstein, anything can happen. Nothing ever has to happen, and anything can happen. But I think the leadership of the place, plus wise leadership, plus some luck, you always need some luck, has made it possible to have these 3 very strong kind of intellectual domains: graduate education, faculty research on the arts and sciences, distinguished professional schools, and then this very flourishing, large, now hope not to get any larger, but large college that's so attracted. And Jim Nondorf and his staff, Peter Wilson, do such a fabulous job of every year recruiting such wonderful undergraduate students who are really not only worthy of the place, but whose culture contributes to this this devotion to academic excellence. If you don't have your undergraduates buying into that proposition, you have real problems with the kind of value structure. You can paper your wall with all kinds of principles. If the undergraduates don't understand what that means, you have a problem. And we've been blessed by having our undergraduates do understand what our value structures are.
Wonderful. All right, last question. As you look back at the university's history, what do you see that is particularly relevant to today's story?
Well, we could talk about the importance of free expression and and academic freedom, and those are very important, and those are deep within our past and our living present, and must be protected into the future. But to go back to those norms and values are embedded with a set of other norms about the importance of academic excellence. This is a place that has a very low tolerance of mediocrity of any kind, deep commitment to merit, including merit of people from all walks of life and all kinds of kind of social backgrounds. And so that it's important to remember where we came from, and that we were, in some ways, the university we celebrate today already existed in a very fulsome way by 1950 or 1960. And it's changed demographically and so forth. But I come back to the Calvin report and the Shills report, these kind of emblematic documents that people cite generally, I think, favorably, they can be debated. They represent a kind of great tradition. And we need to celebrate that tradition. We need to protect that tradition, but we need to understand how it applies in our lives, because that's how we're going to continue to protect the university in our time. So it's important to have doctrines and dogmas, but it's also important to understand the cultural context out of which they came, because that context was so important in making those documents actually relevant and workable and successful when they were written and as they continue to be applied today.
Wonderful. Well, I would like to thank first John Boyer. Thank you so much for being here to discuss your enlarged edition of your History of the University of Chicago. Thank you also for writing it and for the extraordinary gift that it is to this institution, to all of the people who've made it such a big part of their lives, to have this incredible, rich document of its history. This has been wonderful. I'd also like to thank everyone who's been here as a guest, and thanks those of you who submitted questions. It's been wonderful to have you all here. And I will invite Lauren back.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I'll start by echoing your thanks to John, but also thanks to you for just such an insightful discussion. And I do want to thank all of you for joining us and for your more than 50 thoughtful questions. There are so many that I wish that we could have gotten into. And if you're on campus for Alumni Weekend, or you're planning to join us for Alumni Weekend, May 1st through 4th, you'll have the opportunity to do just that. John will be joining us for another conversation about the book, and you may be able to get your book signed to answer one of those questions that we were asked in the chat. So really, we are a thriving community thanks to all of you, and I want to thank you for being here. We talked about Alumni Weekend. Because we have an international audience, I just want to share one more opportunity that we have to engage with faculty in the weeks ahead. We will be in London on April 22nd with David Axelrod and Christiane Amanpour for a conversation on populism, Putin, and the shredding Atlantic Alliance. And then 2 days later, on April 24th, David will travel actually to the John W. Boyer Center in Paris for another conversation on the topic with Clarissa Ward, CNN's chief international correspondent, and Roger Cohen, the New York Times Paris bureau chief. So hopefully we will see you in person soon in a city around the world on campus for Alumni Weekend. But most importantly, many thanks again, Steve and John, to you and to all of you for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day.